What just happened to Iran is not one more headline. It is not one more strike. It is not one more Middle East flashpoint that flares up, dominates the news for a day, and then fades into the background. No. What happened here is much bigger than that. Because when the United States hits a country this hard, militarily, economically, politically, strategically, the question is no longer just how much damage was done. The real question becomes this: what kind of country comes out on the other side? And that is why you need to stay with me through this whole video. Because this story is not just about explosions. It is about collapse pressure. It is about leverage. It is about whether Iran can still fight, still negotiate, still rebuild, and still convince the world that it has not been pushed into a completely different reality. And if you listen closely to what officials are saying and what they are not saying, you start to realize something very uncomfortable. Trump did not just hit Iran hard, he may have changed the entire shape of this conflict. Now let's get clear on one thing right away. The phrase, "they can't recover," is stronger than what reliable reporting actually proves. Reuters reports that the U.S. Israeli campaign that began on February 28th killed Iran's supreme leader and much of the senior leadership, while the U.S. says it aimed to dismantle Iran's military capabilities and block any path toward a nuclear weapon. But Reuters also reports that Iran is actively trying to rebuild ballistic missile inventories, and the U.S. is still extending military and economic pressure because the war is not truly settled. That matters, because if you want to understand what is happening, you have to separate the dramatic slogan from the real strategic picture. Did Trump hit Iran hard? Absolutely. So hard that the pressure is now visible across leadership, infrastructure, military planning, maritime trade, diplomacy, and the global energy system. Reuters reports that the U.S. naval blockade that began in mid-April is now being expanded globally, with the Pentagon saying ships leaving the Strait of Hormuz for any international destination need U.S. Navy approval. That is not symbolic pressure. That is systemic pressure. That is the kind of move that tells you Washington is not just trying to punish Iran. It is trying to control the environment around Iran. And once a war reaches that stage, the damage is no longer measured only by what gets bombed. It is measured by what gets restricted, what gets delayed, what gets isolated, and what gets forced into survival mode. Now here is where this gets serious. When people hear Trump hit Iran, they usually picture one thing: airstrikes. And yes, the strikes matter. Reuters reports that the initial campaign on February 28th was devastating, targeting Iranian leadership and military capabilities. The political shock alone was enormous. You are not talking about a limited signal strike here. You are talking about the opening of a war that immediately pushed the region into crisis, triggered Iranian retaliation, and set off weeks of global economic and diplomatic fallout. But military damage is only one layer. What Trump has done since then is arguably even more important. He kept the pressure alive. He extended the ceasefire without ending the coercion. AP reports that Trump said he was extending the ceasefire while keeping the U.S. military blockade of Iranian ports in place and leaving forces ready for further action. Reuters reports the Pentagon now says that blockade is going global. That combination changes everything, because a ceasefire without relief is not really peace. It is suspended pressure. And suspended pressure can be more destabilizing than open war because it forces the other side to negotiate while still bleeding economically, militarily, and politically. That appears to be exactly what Iran is facing right now. Take the missile issue. One of the biggest myths in this conflict is that if Iran is still launching threats or talking tough, then the U.S. campaign must have failed. That is too simplistic. Reuters reports that the U.S. has now imposed new sanctions on 14 people and companies helping Iran obtain weapons precisely because Tehran is trying to rebuild ballistic missile inventories after U.S.-Israeli attacks. In plain English, Iran was hit hard enough that rebuilding became urgent. That is a huge admission about the scale of the damage. Countries do not rush to rebuild strategic missile stocks unless those stocks took a serious hit. And yet that also tells you Iran is not finished. This is why the phrase "can't recover" has to be handled carefully. Iran can still act. Iran can still threaten. Iran can still negotiate from a position of pain rather than complete collapse. But it is doing all of that under much harsher conditions than before. That is the real story. Now think about what that means from Washington's perspective. Trump can now argue that the campaign worked in the most important ways. It decapitated leadership. It degraded capabilities. It forced Iran onto the back foot. It pressured Iranian shipping. It deepened Tehran's economic vulnerability. And it put the United States in a position to demand a deal while controlling key pressure points. Reuters quotes Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying Iran still has a chance to make a good deal by giving up its nuclear ambitions in a verifiable way. That is not the language of a country looking for an equal negotiation. That is the language of a country negotiating from dominance. And dominance is exactly what makes this phase so dangerous. Because once one side thinks it has the upper hand, it tends to push harder. And once the other side feels cornered, it tends to look for ways to prove it still has teeth. That is why this war remains unstable even after so much damage. Reuters reports that as of April 24th, peace talks in Islamabad still had not materialized despite heavy lockdowns in preparation, while AP reports Trump is sending envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Pakistan for further talks with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. In other words, diplomacy is alive, but only barely, and only because everyone understands how dangerous the alternative still is. Now here's the contradiction at the center of all this. If Trump hit Iran so hard, why is the U.S. still pushing a blockade, sanctions, and emergency diplomacy? Because hard damage is not the same thing as final control. That is the lesson here. You can hit a country hard enough to change its behavior without hitting it hard enough to eliminate its capacity to resist. And that appears to be where Iran is right now. Weakened? Yes. Humiliated in major ways? Yes. Under intense pressure? Yes. Unable to recover at all? That is less clear. But the fact that Tehran is rebuilding missiles, still bargaining, still using maritime pressure when it can, and still forcing Washington to negotiate tells you something important. The damage is severe enough to reshape Iran's options, even if it has not erased them. That reshaping is where Trump's real impact shows up. Look at the sea. Reuters reports the U.S. has turned back dozens of ships under the blockade and is monitoring and intercepting vessels tied to Iranian ports across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. That means Iran's strategic problem is no longer confined to its own coastline or the Persian Gulf. Its maritime vulnerability has become global. That is brutal pressure. And it has consequences that go beyond military headlines. Shipping risk, insurance costs, trade disruption, political embarrassment, and a growing message to other states and companies. Doing business with Iran may now come with far more friction than before. That is what modern pressure looks like. Not just bombs, systems, restrictions, control points, friction. Now add sanctions to that picture. Reuters reports new U.S. sanctions are specifically targeting networks helping Iran replenish weapons. That means Washington is not only trying to stop what Iran has now, it is trying to slow what Iran can become later. That is a long war strategy, and it is one reason this campaign hits so hard, because it is not just about smashing current capability, it is about poisoning the recovery path. If your missile stocks are hurt, your suppliers are sanctioned, your shipping is pressured, your diplomacy is constrained, and your economy is taking collateral shock from conflict and blockade, then recovery becomes much harder, even if it remains possible. That is likely the truest version of your title. Not that Iran literally cannot recover, but that the U.S. is trying to make recovery painfully slow, politically costly, and strategically incomplete. And in fairness, the evidence suggests Washington has had real success doing exactly that. Now let's talk about why this matters to an American audience. Because people in the U.S. do not just watch wars like this as distant geopolitical theater, they feel the consequences through oil prices, military risk, political divisions, and global instability. Reuters reports the conflict has contributed to regional instability, rising U.S. consumer prices, and growing domestic political pressure on Trump ahead of midterm elections. That is a key point. Trump may believe he hit Iran hard enough to force a deal, but the longer this drags on, the more the costs spread. Not only to Iran, to the region, to shipping, to global markets, and to U.S. politics itself. That means the window for converting military pressure into political success may be narrower than it looks. And that is why Islamabad matters so much. Reuters reports there have been lockdowns and uncertainty around the talks, with no confirmed meeting yet as of April 24th. AP reports envoys are now expected to head there. That tells you something simple but important. Even after inflicting heavy damage, Washington still needs an exit ramp. Because pressure without closure can become a trap for the side applying it too. This is where the human side of the script matters most. Imagine being in Tehran right now. Your country has been struck hard enough that leadership was shattered. Your missile program is being targeted and sanctioned. Your shipping routes are under blockade pressure. Your economy is more exposed. Your diplomacy is being dragged into talks from a weaker position. And every day, the message from Washington is basically the same. We can keep doing this. That is crushing pressure. Even if Iran survives it, even if it adapts, even if it finds ways to retaliate, it is surviving under a very different set of conditions than before the war began. That is what people mean when they say Trump hit Iran hard. They mean he changed the baseline. He moved the conflict from ordinary deterrence into forced recalculation. And that is not a small thing. But now comes the most important part. Can Iran recover? The honest answer is maybe partially, maybe slowly, maybe unevenly, but not cheaply, not quickly, and not without major obstacles. Reuters reporting on missile rebuilding, ongoing sanctions, the blockade, and continued diplomacy all point in the same direction. Iran is damaged, constrained, and still dangerous, but it has not disappeared as a strategic actor. That is the reality. And reality is more interesting than slogans, because the real story is not that Iran vanished. The real story is that Trump hit Iran hard enough that everything Tehran does now, rebuild, bargain, retaliate, posture, wait, happens under extreme pressure. That changes the war. That changes the region. And that may change what the next phase looks like. So here is the bottom line. Trump just hit Iran very hard. That part is real. Reuters reports the campaign killed top leadership, aimed to dismantle military capability, and has been followed by sanctions and an expanding blockade. But the bigger truth is this. The damage is not just in the craters. It is in the constraints. It is in the rebuilding struggle. It is in the blocked ships. It is in the sanctions lists. It is in the delayed talks. It is in the fact that Iran is still trying to recover while the United States is actively trying to shape what recovery even looks like. That is why this matters. Because sometimes the hardest hit is not the one that destroys everything instantly. It is the one that leaves the other side standing, but standing in a world that has become much harder to survive.